Viewer advisory. The events you are about to witness are based on a true story. Some scenes may be deeply unsettling for certain audiences. Viewer discretion is strongly recommended. The morning shift at Betty's Diner had always been chaos, but that Tuesday in November felt different. The air was thick with more than just the smell of burnt coffee and bacon grease that seemed permanently embedded in the vinyl booths and cracked linoleum floors. Something sinister was brewing beneath the surface of this small-town establishment, and it would take the keen eye of an unlikely observer to expose a web of abuse, theft, and calculated cruelty that had been festering for months. Tonight's story is one that will leave you rattled. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, let's begin. Denise Carter moved through the crowded diner like a dancer navigating a minefield. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate, as she balanced steaming plates against her hip while her left hand remained wrapped in thick white bandages that stretched from her fingertips to her wrist. The injury should have kept her home, should have earned her sympathy and rest. Instead, it had become a target painted on her back, a weakness that her manager Ross Brennan exploited with the precision of a predator who had found the perfect victim. "Move it, Carter. Table 6 is still waiting for their coffee." Ross's voice cut through the morning chatter like a blade, sharp enough to make several customers look up from their newspapers and pancakes. His tone carried a venom that seemed disproportionate to the crime of moving 30 seconds too slowly with a broken hand. But Ross had perfected the art of public humiliation disguised as management. At table 3, Margaret Sullivan and her sister Claire exchanged worried glances. They'd been coming to Betty's Diner for 20 years, watching waitresses come and go, but they'd never seen anything quite like this. "Look at her hand," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the clatter of dishes. "She shouldn't even be working. That bandage looks fresh." Claire nodded, her eyes following Denise as she limped slightly toward the coffee station. "Ross never lets up on her. I've seen the other girls slack off plenty, standing around chatting, but he never says a word to them. It's always Denise he goes after." What the regular customers of Betty's Diner didn't know was that Denise Carter's injury wasn't the result of clumsiness or accident. 3 weeks earlier, she had been cleaning tables after closing time when she heard voices drifting from Ross's office. At first, she thought nothing of it. Managers often stayed late to handle paperwork. But as she moved closer to empty the trash can near his door, the word she heard made her blood run cold. Another $3,000 this week. Ross had been bragging to someone on the phone, his voice thick with alcohol and arrogance. "The old man's books are so sloppy, he'll never notice. And if anyone gets suspicious, well, that's what the Mexican girl is for. She's got enough write-ups to make her the perfect scapegoat." Denise had frozen in the hallway, her cleaning supplies clutched in trembling hands. Ross Brennan was stealing from the diner, skimming money from the register and falsifying reports to cover his tracks. The Mexican girl he referred to so casually was her. Even though she was third-generation Italian-American, Ross had decided her dark hair and olive skin made her an easy target for his prejudices. The conversation had ended abruptly when Ross noticed her shadow under the door crack. What happened next would haunt Denise for weeks. Ross had burst from his office, his face twisted with rage, and grabbed her wrist with such violence that she heard the bones crack. The pain had dropped her to her knees, but Ross had only leaned closer, his breath reeking of whiskey and malice. "Clumsy, aren't you?" he had sneered, twisting her wrist until tears streamed down her face. "Better stay that way. One word about what you think you heard, and you won't just lose your job. You'll lose a lot more than that." Now, 3 weeks later, Denise worked every shift with her hand in a cast, enduring Ross's public humiliation while knowing the truth, that he was not only a thief but a man who would break bones to keep his secrets safe. Every accident he blamed on her clumsiness was another layer of his elaborate cover-up, making her appear incompetent while he systematically robbed the business blind. But what neither Ross nor Denise knew was that someone had been watching, someone who saw through the performance to the truth underneath. Harold Whitman looked like any other retiree killing time over coffee and eggs. His weathered hands spoke of years of manual labor, His quiet demeanor suggested a man content to observe rather than participate. Most customers assumed he was just another local fixture, probably living on Social Security and stretching his breakfast to fill the lonely hours. They couldn't have been more wrong. Harold Whitman was the actual owner of Betty's Diner. For 15 years, Harold had employed the same strategy in all his businesses: remain anonymous, blend in with the customers, and observe how his employees behaved when they thought no one important was watching. It was a philosophy born from years of military service, where the real truth about a unit's effectiveness could only be seen when the officers weren't around. In business, he'd found, people's true nature emerged when they believed themselves unobserved by authority. That morning, as Harold sipped his black coffee from his usual corner booth, he watched Denise struggle through her shift with growing concern. He'd been observing the dynamics at Betty's for months, but today something felt different. The way Ross circled her like a vulture, the way other employees seemed to avoid getting too close when he was berating her, the way customers whispered and shook their heads, it all painted a picture of systematic abuse. "She's trying so hard," Harold heard an elderly woman tell her companion. "But that manager just won't give her a break. Look at that poor hand." Harold's trained eye caught details others missed. The way Denise flinched when Ross approached from behind. How she instinctively protected her injured hand when he got too close. The practiced smile she wore like armor, deflecting pity and questions with professional cheerfulness that couldn't quite hide the pain in her eyes. When Ross deliberately bumped into Denise near the coffee station, causing her to spill hot liquid across her apron, Harold's jaw tightened. The accident was clearly intentional, designed to create another opportunity for public humiliation. Ross's exaggerated sigh of frustration carried perfectly to every table in the restaurant. "Jesus, Carter, can't you do anything right? Maybe we need to get you some training wheels for these coffee pots." The cruelty in his voice was unmistakable, and several customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Harold noticed how the other waitresses looked away, their faces showing the familiar expression of people who wanted to help but feared becoming targets themselves. That afternoon, when the lunch crowd had thinned, Harold made his first direct move. He approached Ross with the casual demeanor of a customer making conversation, but his questions were carefully chosen. "That waitress with the injured hand," Harold said, stirring his coffee slowly. "Seems like she's having a tough time. What happened to her?" Ross's response was immediate and well-rehearsed. "Denise? She's accident-prone. Always has been. Clumsy as they come. I got a file full of incident reports on her. Broken dishes, spilled orders, customer complaints. Honestly, I keep her on out of the goodness of my heart, but some people just aren't cut out for service work." Every word felt like a lie to Harold's experienced ear. He'd watched Denise work for months, had seen her handle busy shifts with grace and efficiency that impressed even the most demanding customers. The only complaints he'd witnessed came from Ross himself. "That's generous of you," Harold replied neutrally, though inside he felt his blood pressure rising. "Must be frustrating for you." Ross puffed up with false magnanimity. "Well, sometimes you have to carry the weak ones. It's not her fault she's not very bright. Some people just need extra patience." The condescension in Ross's voice was so thick it was almost visible, and Harold found himself thinking of his drill sergeants who had possessed the same talent for public humiliation disguised as leadership. But this wasn't the military, where harsh treatment might forge stronger soldiers. This was a civilian workplace where a woman was being systematically destroyed by a man who seemed to enjoy her suffering. That evening, after most customers had gone home, Harold lingered over his pie and coffee, positioned where he could observe the closing routines. What he saw confirmed his worst suspicions. When Denise asked for help moving a heavy tray with her good hand, Ross ignored her completely, continuing his conversation with another employee while she struggled. When she finally managed to clear the table alone, visibly exhausted and wincing with pain, Ross made a show of checking his watch. "About time, Carter. Maybe tomorrow you can try not to take all day with a simple table." Harold watched Denise's shoulders sag slightly, her professional smile wavering for just a moment before snapping back into place. In that instant, he saw something that reminded him of soldiers he'd known. Good people pushed beyond their limits, maintaining their composure through sheer force of will while being systematically broken down by those who should have been protecting them. The next morning brought Harold back to Betty's diner, but this time he wasn't just observing. He was investigating. His years of running businesses had taught him that financial misconduct and employee abuse often went hand in hand. Bullies needed cover for their other crimes, and vulnerable employees made perfect scapegoats. A casual request to use the restroom gave Harold access to the back hallway, where Ross's office door stood slightly ajar. The scene inside told a story of chaos and deception. Stacks of misconduct reports covered the desk, most bearing Denise's name and detailing infractions that seemed petty and vindictive. Spilled drinks, slow service, attitude problems, page after page of documentation that painted her as incompetent and unreliable. But Harold's experienced eye caught something more sinister in the financial records scattered across the desk. Cash register tallies that didn't match deposit slips. Inventory reports that showed shortages with no corresponding explanations. The patterns were subtle but unmistakable to someone who had spent decades in business. Money was disappearing, and the paperwork was being manipulated to hide the theft. Harold photographed everything with his phone, his military training serving him well as he documented evidence with methodical precision. The misconduct reports alone told a damning story. Every incident was minor, every explanation was vague, and every date coincided with periods when the financial discrepancies were largest. Denise was being set up to take the fall for Ross's embezzlement. The real breakthrough came when Harold stayed late enough to overhear a conversation that chilled his blood. Ross was in his office with two friends, their voices carrying through the thin walls as they celebrated their latest scheme. $5,000 this week alone, Ross bragged, his words slurred with alcohol. And the beauty is, when the old man finally notices the money missing, guess who's got the most write-ups? Little Miss Clumsy out there with the busted hand. One of his companions laughed. You're playing with fire, man. What if she talks? Ross's response was delivered with casual cruelty that made Harold's stomach turn. She won't. Not after what happened last time she got nosy. That hand didn't break itself, you know. Sometimes you have to send a message people understand. The laughter that followed was the sound of men who enjoyed causing pain, who found entertainment in another person's suffering. Harold remained frozen in the shadows of the hallway, his hands clenched into fists as the full scope of the abuse became clear. Ross hadn't just stolen money and falsified reports. He had deliberately injured Denise to keep her silent, then used her injury as an excuse to humiliate her publicly while covering his crimes. Harold left the diner that night with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his military days. Injustice was a cancer that spread when good people did nothing, and he had seen enough good soldiers destroyed by corrupt officers to know that intervention was sometimes the only moral choice. Denise Carter deserved better than to suffer in silence, while her abuser profited from her pain. The next morning, Harold arrived at Betty's diner with a folder of evidence and a plan that would expose Ross Brennan for exactly what he was. But first, he had phone calls to make, to the police, to his lawyer, and to the regional manager who handled his business interests. By the time the morning rush began, the wheels of justice were already in motion. Ross strutted through the dining room with his usual arrogance, barking orders at Denise and making snide comments about her pace. He had no idea that his victim had gained a powerful ally, or that his crimes had been documented by someone who understood both business law and military justice. The performance he had been conducting for months, the helpful manager dealing patiently with an incompetent employee, was about to be revealed as the elaborate fraud it had always been. Harold watched from his corner booth as Denise balanced trays with practiced skill, her injured hand protected, but her spirit unbroken despite weeks of abuse. She had no idea that her tormentor's reign of terror was about to end, or that her quiet dignity in the face of cruelty had impressed someone who had the power to change everything. The morning shift was in full swing when Harold made his move. He stood up from his corner booth and walked to the center of the dining room, where conversations quieted and faces turned toward him with curiosity. This quiet old man who had been part of the scenery for months was suddenly commanding attention, and something in his posture suggested that important news was coming. "Good morning, everyone," Harold began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I think it's time you all knew who I really am." Ross looked up from the register with mild annoyance, assuming another customer was about to complain about slow service or cold coffee. "Sir, if there's a problem with your meal, I can." "I'm Harold Whitman," he interrupted, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Ross with laser intensity. "I own this diner." The silence that followed was absolute. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence, and every pair of eyes in the restaurant turned toward the unassuming man who had just revealed himself as their boss. Denise dropped her dish rag, her mouth falling open in shock as she processed the revelation that the quiet customer she'd served countless times was actually the owner of the establishment. Ross's face went through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, disbelief, fear, and finally a desperate attempt at his usual charm. "Mr. Whitman, I had no idea you were. If I'd known you were evaluating us, I would have." "You would have what?" Harold's voice was steady but cold. "Treated your employees with basic human decency? Stopped stealing from the register? Avoided breaking a woman's hand to keep her quiet about your crimes?" The accusations hung in the air like a physical presence, and the dining room erupted in whispers and gasps. Customers turned to stare at Ross, whose face had gone pale as understanding dawned that his carefully constructed lies were crumbling around him. Harold pulled out his folder of evidence and placed it on the nearest table, pages spilling out for everyone to see. Financial records, misconduct reports, photographs of discrepancies that painted a clear picture of systematic theft and abuse. "For months, I've watched you steal money, falsify reports, and torment this woman for having the misfortune of discovering your crimes." Denise stood frozen by the coffee station, tears streaming down her face as the truth she had carried alone for weeks was finally exposed to the light. The regular customers who had witnessed her daily humiliation now understood that every cruel comment, every public berating, every accident that made her look incompetent had been calculated moves in a campaign of psychological warfare designed to protect a thief's cover story. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold continued, his voice rising with the passion of someone who had seen too much injustice, "this woman has been working with a broken hand that was deliberately injured by her supervisor to keep her from reporting as theft. Every day since then, she has endured public humiliation designed to make her appear unreliable so that when his crimes were discovered, she would be blamed." The door chimed as two police officers entered the diner, their presence sending Ross stumbling backward toward the kitchen. Harold had called them that morning, providing evidence and testimony that made arrest inevitable. The careful documentation he had gathered, combined with recorded conversations and financial discrepancies, painted a picture that no lawyer could challenge. "Ross Brennan," the first officer announced, "you're under arrest for embezzlement, assault, and creating a hostile work environment. You have the right to remain silent." The handcuffs clicked around Ross's wrists as his protests filled the air, desperate denials that everyone now recognized as the lies they had always been. His carefully maintained facade of respectability crumbled completely as he was led toward the door, his true nature exposed for everyone to see. Harold turned to Denise, whose tears had shifted from pain to relief as the weight of months of abuse finally lifted from her shoulders. "Miss Carter," he said gently, effective immediately, "you're no longer just a waitress. You're the new assistant manager, with a salary that reflects your actual value to this establishment." The applause that erupted from the customers was spontaneous and genuine, the sound of people celebrating justice finally served. Margaret and Claire from Table 3 were crying openly, their relief palpable as they realized the suffering they had witnessed was finally ending. Other regular customers joined in, their clapping a testament to the dignity and grace Denise had shown even in her darkest moments. Denise collapsed into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fortune that had transformed her from victim to survivor in the span of minutes. The injured hand that had been a symbol of her vulnerability was now evidence of her courage, proof that she had endured unimaginable cruelty without losing her humanity or her determination to keep working. Harold sat back down at his corner booth, but this time he wasn't hiding in plain sight. He was the owner again, ready to rebuild his business on principles of respect and fairness that had been absent for too long. The diner would continue serving coffee and eggs, but it would also serve as a reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, could still triumph over cruelty when good people refused to remain silent. Outside, Ross's shouts faded as the police car pulled away, carrying with it the toxic presence that had poisoned the workplace for months. Inside, the smell of coffee and bacon remained the same, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The fear that had hung over every interaction was gone, replaced by a sense of hope and possibility that permeated every conversation. Denise's story became legend among the staff and regular customers of Betty's Diner, a testament to the quiet strength of those who continue showing up even when the world seems determined to break them. Her broken hand healed, but the courage she had shown while injured inspired everyone who heard her story. She had survived the worst kind of workplace abuse and emerged stronger, her dignity intact and her future secure. Harold returned to his role as the quiet observer, but now his presence carried a different weight. Employees and customers alike knew that someone was watching, someone who cared about fairness and wouldn't tolerate abuse in any form. The diner became a model workplace, a place where people were treated with respect regardless of their position or appearance. In the months that followed, Ross Brennan faced trial for his crimes, the evidence against him so overwhelming that his conviction was never in doubt. The money he had stolen was recovered, the false reports he had filed were exposed, and the pattern of abuse he had inflicted was documented for the court record. Justice was served not just in the legal sense, but in the restoration of dignity to someone who had been systematically dehumanized. Denise's promotion was just the beginning of her transformation. With her tormentor gone and her true abilities recognized, she flourished in ways that impressed even Harold's experienced eyes. The nervous, beaten-down woman who had served coffee with a broken hand became a confident leader who ensured that no employee under her supervision would ever face the kind of treatment she had endured. The regular customers of Betty's Diner witnessed something remarkable: the healing of a workplace poisoned by cruelty, the restoration of human dignity, and the triumph of truth over carefully constructed lies. Margaret and Claire continued their morning visits, but now their conversations were filled with admiration for Denise's strength rather than pity for her suffering. Harold's strategy of observing before acting had revealed the kind of injustice that thrives in shadows, where predators count on silence and isolation to protect their crimes. By stepping into the light and using his authority to protect rather than exploit, he had demonstrated that power could be a force for good when wielded by people who understood the responsibility that came with it. The broken hand that had been Denise's burden became her badge of honor, proof that she had survived something that would have destroyed weaker people. Her story spread beyond the diner, inspiring other victims of workplace abuse to speak up and seek help. The courage she had shown while suffering in silence became a beacon for others trapped in similar circumstances. Justice had been served not through violence or revenge, but through the patient documentation of truth and the courage to act when action was required. Ross Brennan's reign of terror ended not with dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet click of handcuffs and the weight of evidence he couldn't deny. The system had worked because good people had made it work. As the months turned to years, Betty's Diner became more than just a place to eat. It became a symbol of resilience, proof that ordinary people could overcome extraordinary cruelty when they refused to give up hope. Denise's story was told and retold, each telling reinforcing the message that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that truth has a power that transcends temporary suffering. The quiet man in the corner booth had seen enough injustice in his military career to recognize it in civilian life, and his decision to act had changed everything. Harold Whitman's legacy wasn't built on dramatic gestures or public pronouncements, but on the simple recognition that every person deserved to be treated with basic human dignity. Never underestimate the quiet strength of those who keep showing up, even when the world seems determined to break them. Denise Carter's story proves that truth ultimately triumphs over lies, that justice can emerge from the darkest circumstances, and that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one who has been watching and waiting for the right moment to act. Her broken hand healed completely, but the strength she discovered while it was injured remained with her forever. The diner that had been her prison became her kingdom. The customers who had pitied her became her admirers, and the future that had seemed so hopeless became bright with possibility. Justice wasn't just served, it was celebrated, honored, and remembered as proof that even in the darkest circumstances, good people can find ways to triumph over evil. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their suffering hasn't gone unnoticed, and drop a comment below to let us know how this story moved you. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light, because every voice matters and every story of triumph over injustice deserves to be heard.